Hello again, friends, and welcome back to another edition of Jim Cornette's Drive-Thru right here, wherever it is that you find us every Monday, or whenever it is that you listen, wherever it is that you are, each and every week. I am your host, the great Brian Last.
What the fuck
and we're
is
going to
this
be
already
reading your
now?
questions this
What
week.
the fuck? Wherever you are, whenever you listen, you sound like one of those goddamn metaphysical fucking. Remember on the old Dragnet shows? They show them now on Me TV or somewhere where the fucking beatniks and the hippies were always like, oh man, and then there was fucking, Friday and Gannon to shut them down. And
well, you're certainly the Joe Friday here. You got on me last week about the fact that I was too chipper, that I was too awake, that I was too lively, that I was too into the show. You said, hey, well, tone it down. So I tone it down and you still jumped down.
Now you're so fucking toned down. You sound like Cheech and Chong, wherever you are, man. Wherever you find us, man.
I wish I felt like Cheech and Chong right now.
Ooh, man. For heaven's sake. This is a program where we disseminate knowledge to the wrestling fans. They ask the questions, not even the wrestling fans, but fans of the cult of Cornette, fans of life in general. Wisdom. Fans of wisdom that come here to search for a better way forward, to have a better understanding of things that have happened, that they've seen in the world around them. They ask us the questions, and I answer them.
It's not about being a fan of wrestling. You have to be a fan of breathing to send me questions.
You got to be a fan of life in general. You could ask me life questions here also. Maybe that would make the show even more popular if people ask me questions about life, romance, finance.
We do get some questions every now and then sent in asking for advice. Not questions like, hey, tell me about this in wrestling history, but Jim, what should I do in this situation?
Well, we ought to broaden up our scope here and get some broader questions to give the people some hope that somehow there's a path forward. You can find a way. We can help you with your problems here. If I can't, the Cult of Cornette can, because we cult cast to the millions and millions around the world. What do we do? 1 million downloads a month on these half-baked programs. There's no reason why we can't. If we can't solve a problem, we can bring light to it, and then others in the cult of Cornette can solve it, much as we have done. To be quite honest with you, with the opioid crisis in West Virginia, that we actually have our staff legal analyst, crack attorney, Stephen P. New, the law office of Stephen P. New, newlawoffice.com, 888-692-8084. He is actually representing Cult of Cornette members around the country now on various, not charges, but various cases. And it's an example of how we can help people out with their daily lives as well as their wrestling education. And like we mentioned last week, and of course we are in a time warp, folks, because as you listen to this, just this past weekend, I was in a successful event at C2E2, and the Have a Beef with Jim Cornette was sold out, and I'm sure it was a lovely time, but I haven't done it yet, so I can't comment on it. But we mentioned last week on the program here that we actually did just a short time ago that Stephen P. New is not only helping people with cases against the big oil companies and the big pharmaceutical companies and big companies like General Motors and Universal Studios and Amazon, but specifically helping the families of babies born addicted to opioids, whether it be the synthetic kind or the homemade kind or the pharmaceutical kind or whatever, over in West Virginia and across the country. So if anybody in your family has been affected by this, and a lot of times it's up to not just the mothers and fathers, but the grandmothers and grandfathers to speak up for these kids, there is a place you can go, newlawoffice.com, Stephen P. New, and he'll be there April 13th in Madison, West Virginia as well to present proclamations to Smoky Mountain legends Tracy Smothers and Bobby Fulton, and also referee Brian Logan, on their contributions to pro wrestling in West Virginia over the last 30 years. So Stephen's one of us. He ought to write a question in sometime. We ought to take a question from Stephen P. New.
I'm sure he's looking forward to serving Tracy and Bobby in West Virginia on the 13th.
He's not serving them. He's giving them a proclamation. It's not they don't have to go to court over this.
Well, we'll see what happens there.
It's a positive thing. It's a very positive thing. Like when Vince started the steroid and the drug testing, in 1986 or whatever, the first time around, and they called the Iron Sheik in the office. They said, Sheik, your drug test came back positive. And Sheik's like, oh, yes, I knew. Oh, Sheik always positive. Yes, positive. Yes, good. No, Sheik. It's bad when you're positive. Positive is bad? How can positive be bad? Sheik, always positive is good. It's positive like that. Not a serving, but a presenting.
Isn't a story also there was another occasion where they're like, you tested positive, and he said, did Don Morocco test positive? Yeah. Did Bob Orton Jr. test positive? Because I was with them. I don't know how true it is, but that was always a story.
Well, you never know with those things. But anyway, what's this program all about again?
It's all about the listeners' questions, and we'll start with one right now that was sent in to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Violet Jennings. What would be your advice, Jim, for a new female wrestler who is 6'8"? And yes, I'm asking this question for myself.
Well, for where do I sign? We would need more information, obviously, but in all honesty, if a woman who was 6'8" was athletic enough, went to a proper training school, and got not just good at wrestling, but was taught from the beginning how to not trying to do stuff that everybody else does, but how to work and be special to accentuate the size and utilize it in a working way to look like a monster. The sky would be the limit, in my opinion, in today's environment. But I would need more information. Especially age and athletic background.
We have another question here, Jim, looking for advice. This was sent in by Brandon, and I'm trying to see if he wants his last name said here on the air, by Brandon Folson. I'm a lifelong fan of you and the Midnight Express. I've been a musician for the last 20 years, but my childhood dream was to be a wrestler. Recently, a tag team from a local wrestling promotion began coming to my shows, and I became their favorite local act. We became friends, and they asked me to be the special referee in their tag match.
This sounds like a fucking Casey Kasem dedication.
I did it, and it was a blast, as I even got to take a bump for my friend. I'm 38 years old. I'm 6'3", 225 pounds. I realize my shot at being a wrestler may be long past, but I'd love to get in the business as a manager because I can talk, and I feel it's a lost art. The music business has almost drove me insane. So would I be crazy at this point in my life to get into the wrestling business? Also, what advice would you have for me? Thanks for a lifetime of entertainment and keep up the great work.
Oh, God. Well, I can't just piss on this, honestly, and I mentioned just in the previous question, I'd need the age and athletic background. For a 6'8" woman who wants to be a wrestler, age and athletic background would be probably more important than a guy who already admits he's 38 years old and doesn't want to be a wrestler, but wants to be a manager. Then the problem becomes 6'3", 225. You're bigger than every fucking wrestler in the business these days. But Diamond Dallas Page started late and originally was a manager and then became a wrestler. That's a very unusual case. Rico Constantino was in his late 30s when he was in the WWE developmental program here in OVW, but he was a physical genetic freak and looked 10 years younger and was a high-level athlete. There's people that defy time and logic, but those are few and far between. I would say the biggest chance that you have is if you want to be a manager on in a local promotion for fun, don't expect anything out of it. And see what happens. But all those things that I mentioned could potentially be working against you, and it would be a sideline. I wouldn't suggest quitting any job that you have that makes actual money to do this full-time, because you won't be full-time anyway. The full-time wrestlers are barely full-time these days.
How old was the boogeyman, Marty Wright, when you got him?
Oh, and he was 40. But remember, he lied about his age on Tough Enough. That's why they kicked him out, because you would believe that he was 10 years younger. I just saw him, and I still believe he's easily 10 or more years younger than he is. because he's in fucking freaky shape. But, once again, that's very unusual. Think of how many wrestlers or prospective wrestlers that you and I have both seen, Brian, over the past 30 years, and how many were that age and how many started out and became a big deal.
Yeah, it's rough. It's not easy. And by the way, I want to point out, Dallas Page was trained to be a wrestler many years before he ever went to the power plant. He was wrestling on Kowalski shows, wasn't he, in Massachusetts in like 1980?
Well, he had training, but his primary calling had been as a manager until he just decided, fuck it, I'm going to get in shape and I'm going to go for this and do this. And he put a lot of hard work into it. And also he came along at the right time. Before or afterwards, 5 years either way probably wouldn't have worked. But it can be done.
Jim, let me ask you another question, but then I know that this week you actually have some questions that were sent directly to you that we're going to get to, but...
Yeah, because I get equal time here. Some of these people are complaining to me that you're cherry picking. And the last thing we want is anybody picking their cherry on this program.
Well, let's see if this is the cherry on top. This question was sent in to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Chad Pierce. In Jim Ross's book, he talks about a meeting between him, Vince, and Linda McMahon, and the Ultimate Warrior in an effort to get the Warrior to come back to WWE. He states that Corny was present at this meeting as well. He goes on to say that the Warrior was fixated on the word destrucity and kept bringing it up over and over again. Jim, can you provide any details to this story or have any other Ultimate Warrior stories in general?
Well, this wasn't when Vince was trying to talk him into it. He pretty much was back, but I believe it was WrestleMania in Anaheim in 96. We were informed by Vince that me and Bruce and JR would be, because we traveled with Vince at that point, would be stopping in Phoenix to visit the Ultimate Warrior, who was going to tell us all about how, I don't know how this was presented, his philosophy, how he wanted to be presented, who the Warrior was, get the creative team all behind that type of deal, right? I'd never met the guy before in my life. I'd never been a fan of the Ultimate Warrior because that was the antithesis of, in my opinion, everything that was wrong with fucking wrestling business. This no talent fucking muscle-headed hack that had been pushed to the moon by a guy that was a fan of bodybuilders and by somehow fucking mass hypnosis was able to convince them for a short window of time in the late 80s that this guy could fucking wrestle and was somehow somebody you'd pay to see. His interviews were the shits. His matches were the shits. He never tried to learn. He didn't want to be one of the boys, and he never even apologized for breaking Bobby Heenan's neck, which Bobby told me that personally. So I really, was like, oh boy, this is going to be great. And I promise you, this meeting lived up to every single thing. We went to lunch at a nice chain restaurant. And then we went and saw his gym where he had a wrestling ring set up and he was talking about a wrestling school. And I couldn't hardly contain my fucking reaction to the thought of Ultimate Warrior teaching people to wrestle. But the whole thing he was talking, it was his, God damn it, Bruce, I'm sure, could do this perfectly. But Destrucity was destiny, truth, and something to do with city. I don't fucking know. And it was the goddamn philosophy that he was trying to push. And he had this, and he was out. It's hard to explain. At the end of spending 4 or 5 hours with him that day, I asked Vince the rest of them. I said, I didn't understand a goddamn word this fucking guy said all day. Is he out of his fucking mind? And they said, yeah, it's a Warrior. But it was his philosophies and the always believe and the face paint and Vince, I can see it's going to be huge. And I don't know what the fuck they were talking about. And it wasn't, what was it? Just a few months later, he had that comic book coming out also. And this is when he had run through all the fucking heels and beat them flat and buried them in short order. And then decided to no-show for whatever reason. He was upset that his father had died, even though he had before in his life said he hated his father and he hadn't seen him in these many years. But suddenly when he started no-showing is because his dad had died. But then even after the funeral, he wouldn't come back. And then he was mad because they had a branding show, a toy fair, some kind of fucking big wing-ding in New York, and the WWF had already had a booth scheduled and built, but since Warrior had just signed a contract to come back to the WWF, they wanted him to be represented, so they put his face paint and his logo, Always Believe, on the side of the booth with the other stars, stuff, and he got hot at that because they were using his logo without fucking permission. But if Vince was to buy 1 million copies of the comic book that he had coming out at that point at $1 a piece, then he would consider, well, that's okay, then we'll drop the whole thing, and that would be a considerable makeup for Vince to do. And Vince had the appropriate reaction of, are you out of your fucking mind? I'm not buying $1 million fucking dollars worth of your comic books. And then I think that's when Vince put Warrior on the deal where I will prorate your fucking money. I think like he did with Sid. I'll prorate your fucking money if you show up. And he didn't, I don't know what the fuck that was. And then we didn't have to deal with the Ultimate Warrior anymore. And I was so fucking happy. And I've learned to like him even less since I've heard all the things that he said about politics and gay people and his right-wing fucking nutcase goddamn space fucking cadet conspiracy theories and all the rest. He was an unsavory human being. He was a discredit to our business, and I'm sorry he's dead, but it didn't change who the fuck the prick was in life. So what do you want me to say?
All right, Jim, I understand you have some questions for the listeners.
I mean, what the fuck? No, what the fuck? It's just, anyway.
Did anyone there ever say what he was like when he first got in or when he first started getting a push? Was he always nuts and they didn't think it would get out of control? Or did them making him the champion, him making all that merch money, did it go to his head? Did anyone ever say what he was like before you got there?
Well, I don't know much about, I think a little of both. I think he never understood the wrestling. That's why Watts kicked him out of Mid-South. He never understood the wrestling business or never, I mean, Sting, I think he wrote a book. I'm sure he did. Everybody else has. But I remember reading something that Sting wrote about Warrior early in their career, just, that he didn't get why, these people that are smaller or not as fucking well built as him should be able to beat him. He never got it from Phil Hickerson, who would have pulled his fucking eyeballs out and shoved them up his ass after chewing on them in a real fucking fight anywhere in the vicinity of Jackson, Tennessee. But it just, he never got it. And Vince was the perfect place for him to go to not ever have to get it. Because all Vince wanted was the appearance and the body and have guys bounce off of him and he could smash the fucking piece of shit over. But he's the female Sable to me. Somebody that.
Well, the male Sable.
Well, there you go. Well, you never know. I mean, Sable could have had a questionable start in life. She had. But no, it's one thing to take guys who aren't great performers and make money with them. That's been done in wrestling since the dawn of time. But it's more palatable when they are cooperative and when they realize that what you're doing for them and that they don't know everything. But when they get big fucking heads and think they're the biggest goddamn star in the business and everything has been handed to them and catered and choreographed around them and they are actually useless except for the way that they look when they're standing there stock still, fuck those people. I'm saying, give the opportunity to somebody else, in my opinion. But anyway.
Hey, you mentioned that Sting book before. Did you hear about that book?
Apparently not.
It stunk.
What?
No, I'm sorry. Bad joke there. But anyway, continue on.
Sting stunk. Oh, God. Wait a minute. Hold on. All right. Anyway, I have a couple of emails from people. This is a question that's never been asked before, but it brings up an interesting story. From David, Mr. Cornette, I'm watching World Class on the WWE Network. On the March 23rd, 1985 show, Hercules Hernandez makes his debut as Sunshine's Mystery Man against Rip Oliver. You sell it as a huge shock. Bill Mercer has no clue who he is. And they actually did. Here, Hercules had been a tremendous fucking addition to the roster in Mid-South Wrestling in 84. I loved that fucking guy as a person and as a worker. He had the body of a god. I mean, like 5% body fat, 6'3", 275, jacked to the gills. He did an interview on Mid-South TV one time. He's standing behind me. I'm cutting a fucking promo, and I just look up at him, and he hits the double bicep, and he says, "See, Hacksaw Duggan, 10 Diana ball a day, brother." You know, he was jacked to the gills, and everybody knew it, but that's back when you could do that type of thing. But he could move, he could take backdrops, and he could take bumps, and he could move like a cat, and he looked good running across the ring, and his work was just excellent. And he saved my life a couple times from fucking fans. But when they bring him over to Mid-South to be Sunshine's surprise babyface against my Rip Oliver, crippler Rip Oliver, they didn't tell Bill Mercer, the announcer, "Oh, this is Hercules Hernandez," or "Hercules, this is the big fucking star. You've seen him on," because Mid-South TV's right next door to Dallas, right?
Yeah.
They did, "Well, who's this huge man?" Just like it was probably Ken Mantell. "Let's shock him. You know, a mystery man out of nowhere." Yeah, from the next territory over that anybody that lives fucking 100 miles down the road can fucking see on their TV. Anyway, I sell it as a shock, obviously, because I said I'm going to goddamn not have it amnesia. And, you know, so I did my own thing. Even if they're shocked, I'm not, because I've got a history with this guy, and that's the whole fucking point of the thing. Anyway, however, the deal is that there's going to be a second to where I'm like, "Oh, come on, Herky, you know, we got a history, brother." And he's going to put an exclamation point on the fact that he's with Sunshine by snatching me up by the neck and picking me up and doing the old hangman thing where he's hanging me by my neck, the double-handed choke, you know, up in the air, and then the Midnight Express will come and hit and save me. Well, they couldn't start coming until he grabbed me. But because in the Sportatorium, they had to start coming from up the hill, as I've mentioned on the show here before, where the locker rooms were. Even though Bobby and Dennis were both pretty quick in those days, as soon as he snatches me, they got to come out that fucking door and they got to run down that goddamn ramp. And there's people trying to trip them because even though the security guys are coming, they're having to run too. And it took forever, finally to fucking, for them to get in there. And I've got a picture on my wall of me with my eyes popped out and I'm up and my face is turning red. And Herc is straining at this point because I was about 230. And I went up there easy, but he's had me for a while. So I was about 3 inches taller after that angle was over with. But I just wanted to mention Hercules because we don't get enough questions about him. He was one of those guys in the business that could only be in the wrestling business. There would be no other place where a human being like this would fit. When he showed up in Louisiana, he had just been assassin number 2 with Jody Hamilton in the Carolinas. And he had been, you know, the big jacked up assassin that that would do all the heavy lifting, right? So when he comes in, he has brought a girlfriend. I can't remember what her name was. And boy, she was bad news. But he's brought a girlfriend with him. He's got this old, I can't remember what kind of car it was, but it was like Bobby had an old 70s Lincoln Continental, one of those cars you had to, you know, pay like 3 parking meters. And Hercules had kind of the same thing. Those big old cars you could travel in and put a lot of big guys in. But it was old. And him and his girlfriend at several points during his stay in Louisiana were living in that fucking car with a couple of cats in the back seat and everything they had in the trunk or whatever. And then finally he got an apartment. One night I'm coming back from Jackson, Mississippi. And it was on a Wednesday night, so I had already been in Shreveport for promos that morning. So the Midnight Express got to just leave in the afternoon and leisurely drive the 200 miles from Alexandria to Jackson. But I'd already been in Shreveport doing 6 hours of promos and then had to drive over to Jackson and make a show. So I'm going home myself, middle of the night. Between Jackson, Mississippi and Alexandria, Louisiana, 2-lane road, probably about 1 in the morning, 1:30. And it's starting to be fall, as I recall, so that it's chilly outside. I'm driving down the road, not a car in sight. Suddenly I see tail lights. But the tails, it's over on the shoulder of the right-hand shoulder of the road, right? And I'm coming up on it fast, so if I'm doing 55, it can only be doing 25 or 30. And as I get close enough, I see that it's Hercules' car. And his driver's door, his driver's side door that he would get out on, is open at a complete 90-degree angle to the rest of the car. And, farther than it would open, right? Normally.
Right.
And there's nothing behind me, so I pull up, and he's just down to 20 miles an hour down the fucking shoulder, and I pull up. I'm rolling down the window. I said, Herc, what's going on? He said, oh, man. And the girlfriend's in the passenger side, and the cats are in the back seat. And apparently what had happened was he had pulled over to take a piss or something. He had pulled over for some reason on the side of the road. But when he went to get out, he had failed to notice, and there's a potential he had failed to notice because of other substances that he may have ingested. He had failed to notice that there was a goddamn giant tractor trailer truck coming down the road behind him on this little 2-lane road. He said when he opened the door, that fucking truck hit the door and fucking bent it all the way out as it went back. And he said, now the door is stuck open and I can't close it. And so I'm driving on the shoulder all the way back to Alexandria. And I swear to God, this was his response to this next statement that I made. We're sitting now, I'm in the road. There's no traffic coming. I'm in the road. He's on the side. I'm through the open window. I said, God damn, Herc. I said, it's lucky that the fucking thing didn't fly off altogether. He said, yeah, thank God I was still holding on to it when he hit it.
Whoa.
This fucking guy, now later on, he got an apartment in Alexandria. That's what I was going to tell you. And he had a beef with his fucking girl. And the girl called him in for being abusive to her or whatever the fuck. And I don't honestly know what happened, but he was not the type of person that, to do that to me if you were a female. However, the fucking Alexandria cops had long history and relationships with wrestlers going to there was a club called the Lighthouse in Alexandria that, believe it or not, only the baby faces, but even some of the more adventurous heels, such as Nature Boy Buddy Landell, would go to this fucking place. I saw it from the road once. It was one of those giant tin sheds in the middle of a field of mud that on a Saturday night, there would be 1,000 pickup trucks surrounding this fucking thing, parked in this mud gravel field. And it was a goddamn bar with beer, liquor, country music, the whole 9 yards. And a lot of the guys would go there. And as a matter of fact, one night, who was it? One of the guys got knocked down by a fan there that night when he was going to take a piss in the bathroom. The reason why the fan knocked him down was because Dr. Death had flying beeled the fan out the bathroom door, and he didn't stop until he hit the fucking wrestler that was going in to take a piss. There was a time where Doc and Herc were a tag team, and they went out with Pee Wee. I think it was at the Lighthouse. And apparently 10 or 12 of the locals decided they didn't like the heel wrestlers, and Dr. Death and Hercules beat up the bar while Pee Wee Anderson, the referee, stripped his shirt off and started doing Hulk Hogan poses on the bar top, standing on it. But anyway, so the cops in Alexandria, they come in to Hercules' apartment because the girlfriends called him in and just came in ready to take him down. His door busts open and he stands up, what the fuck? And it took like 6 or 8 of them, but they choked him out with a nightstick. His eyes were bloodshot, the whole 9 yards, right? He shows up the next day at the show. He said, and I'm hot for him, right? This fucking bitch and these fucking cops and this fucking guy. He said, oh, Jimmy, they were just doing their job. If they hadn't knocked the door down, chances are they'd have got hurt. Okay. Well, yeah. But, what a fucking great guy all around. He really was. He was, and just a nice guy, had a great fucking talent. And I hate that he never got further than he got before he passed away. I mean, he did become a star in the WWF, but he could have been the big deal in a number of the territories in the old days, and he could have been a bigger deal in one of the big companies.
If a guy became a fan in 1989 or so and started watching him in the WWF, they're probably a little surprised when you start off by saying what a good worker he was then. But When you go back to 84 Mid-South, he was really, really good.
Oh, good Lord. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. I think a combination possibly of his outside the ring habits and, then lack of motivation at some point when you get up there and it wasn't really a time where the guys were expected to do anything. Vince was selling sizzle, not steak. So, and then, there you go. Anyway, I have another email here. You may be able to assist with this. I'll tell you why in a minute. Ross writes, "Hi, Jim. First things first, I started seeing you on television when you debuted on TBS, and my loving grandmother, who I never heard say a cross word about anyone, she would wish a horrible demise on you weekly, saying, 'I wish they'd hang him by his thumbs and cut his nuts off.'" I was shocked and entertained all at the same time.
Thanks, Grandma.
My question, sir, is this. Did the NWA committee have as much influence on the NWA World Tag titles as they did with the world title? That kind of took a left turn there, but that's what I wanted your help on. How many territories in the day had an NWA World Tag Team title?
Oh, geez. Detroit,
Charlotte.
Florida did at various points. Florida had various tag team titles in there, I believe.
There was a world tag title. I think a lot of times in the 60s and 70s, I think the Von Brauners may have brought that in, maybe.
Right. Well, speaking of the Von Brauners, I would go with Tennessee.
Yeah, because there was a world tag team title in Tennessee whenever either the Von Brauners were hot or the Fabulous Kangaroos, because the Kangaroos in the early 70s were still, that name was still so hot and recognized as world champions from the run where they did the huge sellouts in the Garden back in, 1960, 61 or whatever. So they would kind of be recognized as world tag team champions if they came in. There was a world tag team title in Amarillo for a while, was there not?
Yeah, Amarillo. I was about to go to the West Coast before I was going to ask, did you say NWA members only or just anyone who was promoted?
Well, no, this is the NWA, because there was, then we'd open it up to Indianapolis, WWA had a world tag title, AWA, etc. But the point is, no, they didn't, Ross. The answer to the question is the NWA didn't give a fuck about the world tag team titles because by the nature of the beast of wrestling, the NWA and Sam Muchnick and the people who it was important to form the NWA thought that it was better for wrestling if there was one champion. This ran completely antithetical and was anathema to the standard operating procedure of wrestling promoters, which is always to say that my territory has the greatest wrestlers, so I should have the world champion in the world, whatever. So he got it done somewhat with the World Heavyweight Championship, but the tag teams would have been overreaching. And I don't think they were worried about it because, part of it was adding credibility to the business, having one world champion. But when you get into tag teams, et cetera, I think Sam Muchnick or anybody else didn't want to die on that hill. So a lot of territories that didn't want to look too hokey, and once again, Nick Goulas never worried about that, but that didn't want to look too hokey would have a regional title. Even the Carolinas, before that George Scott expanded things in the mid-'70s and brought in Valentine and all those guys, they had the Eastern States Tag Team Championship?
Yeah.
Or there would be a regional title, Georgia Tag Team title, Florida Tag Team title, etc. So it wasn't too ridiculous. But then the Carolinas, to be honest, got to be a big enough territory and had the names where their world tag team title in the late 70s and early 80s was probably as close to a legitimate NWA World Championship as you could get, where there was always top teams holding it, whether Steamboat and Youngblood or the Briscoes or the Funks or whoever the fuck. The World Tag Team title in Detroit was, the Sheik could do anything in that run from the mid-'60s to the mid-'70s. He could get away with anything. Detroit was on fire. It was one of the biggest drawn cities in the country. He didn't ever put the world title on himself. He didn't make his own. He had the U.S. Heavyweight Championship, and he put that on himself, and he kept it, but he was smart enough never to put the world title on himself, because then he would have had to have kept it all that time. He would have had to do a job if he hadn't. But he made world tag team champions for himself, because why the fuck not? And nobody outside of Detroit knew what the fuck was the difference. But so there were different sets of world tag team champions in the NWA, and they went along with it, and it wasn't a big fucking deal. But there was really, I would think in modern times, the Carolinas version was the closest thing to a real world tag title, just because the quality of people that held it and the business and the size of the territory. Just to me.
Yeah.
What do you but what do you think, though?
What do I think about?
Enough talking about me. Let's talk about you. What do you think of me? Who would have been the biggest NWA World Tag Title, the best recognized, the most influential?
Well, you bring up the period of time where Mid-Atlantic really took over with the World Tag Team title, and that's at the same period of time where Detroit lost all of its influence in wrestling, and a lot of the other people who had World Tag Team titles weren't getting the attention. I mean, Steamboat and Youngblood were in the magazines.
Yeah.
So, that was the World Tag Team Championship in the NWA that got magazine attention from the mid to late 70s on.
And then there was really only at that point, the magazine, they recognized the AWA tag title and obviously the WWF or WWF tag title. And even though Indianapolis, as I said, had one, after the Valiant Brothers and maybe the Legionnaires in the mid 70s, Dave Dynasty's out there going, oh, fuck, there was other great teams, but Anyway,
after the Legionnaires, I don't know. Were there?
Well, not the Legionnaires' disease, but Sergeant.
But after the Legionnaires,
were there and Private Don Fargo?
Were there a lot of good tag teams in that territory after the Legionnaires?
Because they came after Ox Baker and Chuck O'Connor, who would later be John Studd, right? They came just after them, and then of course Don Fargo took off, and they replaced him with Private LeBoeuf, who was the Russian stomper in Tennessee, who was Maxine Zaranoff LeBoeuf in the Maritimes in Canada, and was French Canadian.
When did you first meet Don Fargo?
Briefly in let's see, in 1970. Well, I saw him one time walk into the building in 1976, but I didn't meet him. So 1978, when he came back and was working with Al Green and Chris Colt for just that brief period of time. It was the first time I actually met him in person.
Intimidating?
But I saw that. Well, yeah, but no, not because it was one of the Fargos. Yes, but no, he just was fucking fun. And he was actually the first night that I met him. He had come to the Gardens. He'd just come to the territory. And I was back there to take pictures. And he had a beef with the fucking Andy Frayne usher, the security guy they put on the back door because he's only supposed to let wrestlers in, right? Well, he didn't know Don Fargo because he'd just that was his first night in the territory. And it was after all the wrestlers got there. Don Fargo was late. Wonder why? Who knows? And he had trouble talking the guy into letting him in the back door. He said, "Look at my face," because he had gig marks on his cheek, right? He had been doing brass knucks matches for Nick Goulas, and he had gigged his fucking cheek, and he had a gig over his head and his fucking broken nose and all this shit. He said, "Look at my face. I'm carrying a bag. You don't think I'm a wrestler?" And the guy let him. But he was fun and he was easy to talk to once you got over the fact of look at that fucking face and it's Don Fargo.
What about Jackie Fargo? Was he easy to talk to?
Jackie, once again, I didn't get to meet Jackie Fargo in person until I was already well into photography because remember, I didn't start getting in until the end of 76. And Jarrett split off shortly afterwards, and so Fargo never came back to work for him until 79. So I had seen him as a fan, but then I'm actually a photographer, and oh yeah, he's just a hey Pally, how you doing? He'd walked in like that, hey Pally, laughing at everybody, smelled slightly of certain types of whiskey, and then he would come back up and take the pictures or do whatever. But yeah, I didn't get to spend a ton of time around him like the Fabs or guys like that, but. And Rough House was fucking cool too. Except when you were working against him, he was a stiff little prick. He was the stiffest one of the three of them, Rough House. He'd fucking hurt you when he looked at you. Anyway, we have another. Well, this is a regional, a southern regional related question, but this ties into something that we said about on the program about studio announcers. When was that? Last week or whenever that was. Chris says, I grew up watching Saturday afternoon wrestling with my grandfather on WDEF in Chattanooga, Tennessee. That's Channel 12, by the way, folks. Hosted by Harry Thornton. It was a big part of my childhood and a great memory of my papa. It was during the mid-'70s to the early '80s. I was wondering if you had any Harry Thornton stories or stories about that particular region. Harry Thornton was a classic example of the local wrestling announcer that was a bigger star than anybody on the program and was just de-drizzling shits. He was imagine an old gray-haired guy, heavy set, with a little mustache, in one of those late 60s, early 70s leisure suits that I know you never spent a lot of time in East or Central Tennessee, but imagine your uncle, who was an insurance salesman in Oak Ridge, would wear one of these checkered leisure suits, double knit, that looked like your grandmother's fucking kitchen tablecloth. And Harry Thornton did the highest rated morning show in the Chattanooga market. And I think this, there is an excellent Scott Teal and Tim Dills and my gosh, David Williamson may have had something. I can't remember who all did it, but they did a history of Chattanooga wrestling and all the results because Nick and Roy had started running Chattanooga. That was their second town. They started Nashville in 1940. They branched out to Chattanooga sometime in the late 40s, the Nashville booking office. So they had been running the Chattanooga Memorial Auditorium weekly since the 40s. And wrestling was already established, but sometime in the late 50s, early 60s, they made a deal with Harry Thornton. And I don't know what the population of Chattanooga, Tennessee was in like 1960. Maybe some enterprising young man with access to a Google machine while I'm droning on can figure out how many people lived in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1960. But they made a deal with Harry Thornton, and I don't know the particulars, but they got on Channel 12, which was a major network affiliate, and Harry Thornton became not only the host of the studio show in Chattanooga, but he was hosting the most popular morning show in the market, and he also, wouldn't you know who won the pony, became one of the listed promoters, which I think was the way they used to do. If there was a guy in a town that could get you TV, draw you people or whatever, you would cut him in for points in the town, percentage, 5% or 10% or whatever the percent may have been. And so I'm pretty sure that to land this deal and to land Harry Thornton, they cut Harry in for a decent percentage of Chattanooga. And the attendance immediately started going up with the new TV and with this personality on it. And they had runs in the 60s and early 70s where hot programs in the main events, they would sell out the Memorial Auditorium several weeks in a row. And they would regularly do 3,000 people. And I mean, you know, I think they announced in the paper one time they shoehorned 6,400 people into that building, and it was a record crowd. And that had to be with fire department cooperation because it had to be illegal. They had a big set of pull-out bleachers like a graduation or something that they would pull on this massive stage, and then you could put seats all around the ring, and there were permanent seating in a bowl because it was an auditorium type of thing. But they literally packed that place on and off for 20 fucking years through the mid 70s. They would so it figured just if you're even talking about an average of 3,000 or 4,000 people a week, that was 150, 200,000 tickets in a town of what would the population be?
In 1970, it would have been about 120,000. In 1980, about 170,000. So there's the range.
Okay, you're talking about selling better than the population of the town per year in live event wrestling tickets. That's why that guys like Fargo, and a lot of people said that he shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame. What about his drawing power in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame? Guys like that put 5,000 people in buildings every week in Birmingham and Chattanooga, and almost 5 in Nashville. It wasn't that big, and Louisville, and back in those days, almost that. So for so long, because they were kept in top spots for so long, that they actually drew more money than guys who main evented in places like Madison Square Garden or in fucking the Omni for shorter periods of time. They sold more tickets. So Harry Thornton, I'm sure he was a Republican. And I'm sure he'd still be a Republican today. And he had the woman co-host on the morning show was Miss Betty or whatever, and she gave cooking tips. I don't know, but it was everybody in town knew who Harry Thornton was. And so he was an entree for people to watch the wrestling program, and then they'd get caught up in it, especially Harry calling it. And he demanded he would never put the heels over because he was going to stay babyface, right? I mean, he did publicity pictures where in the days before Photoshop, he'd take like the X-Acto knife and cut a picture of himself sitting at his desk and superimpose it in between a picture of Nick Goulas and Roy Welch from Nashville, where he'd be bigger than they were. And so Chattanooga promoters, Harry Thornton, Nick Goulas, and Roy Welch, right? And he would not let the heels get any heat on him whatsoever, verbally, or he would shout them down. And that's what the people loved about the program, was that Harry Thornton would be bickering with the fucking heels who weren't allowed to hit him. So if you couldn't figure out a way to work with him somehow, given the limitations, he'd just bury the heels, take the heat off of them. But what are you going to do? I've got one tape from 1980, I think was right before he retired, and Nick was going out of business anyway, where Bobby Eaton had switched heel and joined Tojo Yamamoto. And Harry would call Bobby and Bobby, it's nice to see you. And he'd shake his hand. I'm sorry to see you in such bad company. He's not going to be mad at Bobby because Bobby's a babyface, right? Or been a babyface. But Tojo, he had nothing good to say about Tojo, and he'd call him a little slant-eyed, no good. And Tojo would say, "What do you got to say to me, Harry Thornton? You want to say something? Spit it out." Or no, Harry Thornton would say, you got something to say, Tojo, spit it out. "Oh, Harry Thornton, you want me to spit in your face? If you do, I'll knock your hat off," or what. I mean, they'd just argue with each other, right? But it drew somehow for all those years. So Harry Thornton is one of those guys that Ed Whalen, Stampede Wrestling, he was a key to getting television. So he was a rotten announcer, but they had to keep him. And he was as big a star, or bigger name identity than anybody on the program. In this market, that was the same thing. And once again, a town of less than 200,000 people selling up to 200,000 wrestling tickets a year. And the most watched local program in the Chattanooga market was Harry Thornton's morning show and live studio wrestling.
It's like, imagine if David Crockett was actually beloved by a local wrestling fan.
Yes, exactly. Well, and one time, and because we used to get the Chattanooga show when there was in Louisville, a lot of times in the mid 70s, there were two local time slots. One would be the Memphis show, and one would be one of Nick's shows that they would bring up to show something different. And Harry Thornton's calling, I think it had to be like 74, Tex McKenzie. Right. It was only fitting that the world's worst wrestling announcer would be calling the world's worst wrestlers match. But Tex McKenzie is legitimately like 6'7" and 265. Right. He was a tall cowboy, and he got over. He was a big name in wrestling, even though he couldn't work because of that charisma and the promo. And he looked like the big cowboy. Right. But he's got the fucking deal he used to do where he's got the head scissors on his opponent, and he's taking that long leg. He'll have the head scissors on the guy on the mat, and he'll take the long leg and stick it straight up in the air and bring it down and do the fucking clop on the guy's fucking neck. Oh, God, he'd sell it. And Harry Thornton, look at that. Look at those long legs. And you can almost hear Nick Goulas whispering to him in the background, "Tell him the boy's 7 feet tall." Yes, he's 7 feet tall, is Tex McKenzie. That's right, a 7 feet tall, 265 pounds. They didn't exaggerate his weight, but they gave him like 6 extra inches. So now he's 7 feet tall and 260 pounds. He looked like a beanpole. But, Harry Thornton. That's at the end of a
Tex
Robin
McKenzie.
Harry Thornton, Tex McKenzie. But there you have it.
The world's worst wrestler, but over everywhere he went.
Yes. But see, here's the thing. We talked about the difference in that and the Ultimate Warrior. Tex McKenzie, from all accounts, I did not get to meet him. I saw him live a number of times as a fan, but he was gone by the time I got into business. But he was a likable guy, friendly to the boys, klutzy, and knew it. Had a weird personal charisma. People liked to see him, and he looked great, and he had the promo, and he was a cowboy. But he knew that guys were helping him, or that, that he didn't think that he didn't come off as the star of the show, and he didn't refuse to learn. He was just a klutz. And it got to be part of the guy's endearing charm at that point. He's the one that fucking Dundee told me the story. He was a huge baby face for Barnett in Australia in the 60s. And they've got Gary Hart in the cage when Tex McKenzie's going to face, Mark Lewin or whoever Gary's charge was. And the first thing that fucking Tex McKenzie does when he gets in the goddamn ring is they're hauling Gary Hart up in the cage, and he grabs the bottom of it and swings it way out, and the people roar. And McKenzie turns around and puts the big hands up like, yeah, I did it. And the cage comes back and fucking hits him in the back of the head and knocks him fucking out cold. Right there. Boom. Done. No match. But, the guys didn't mind if you could draw money with a guy if he knew that you were helping him and he wasn't being a prick about it. But that was not the case with, the female or the male Sable, the Ultimate Warrior. But anyway, hold on here. I got another old story to tell.
The Ultimate Warrior is the female Sable. I love that.
Yeah, well, whatever Well, and by the way, you would think the steroids that the Ultimate Warrior had loaded up on in his period of time, I would think the Little Warrior probably didn't pop out that much. So you never know.
It's a question for Dana Warrior.
If she's on the creative team, maybe she'll come up with a creative answer. Anyway, Daniel writes, I would like Mr. Cornette's opinion on the handling of a finish of a match when the performer who is supposed to win gets injured badly enough that the match needs to come to a sudden stop. My beef has always been with going for the scheduled ending of the injured wrestler going on top, written this way. One of the most famous examples being the Steve Austin-Owen Hart match where the former suffered a neck injury, all because of how phony it looks. Couldn't the other guy win with a change of storyline accordingly, or quite simply end the match as a no contest? Could it be from fear that in doing so, someone wanting to keep their title could deliberately injure the other guy to retain? I think we've gone past that one at this point, although that did happen in years gone by, that it would hurt somebody on purpose just to weasel out of a situation. I'm sure that was in the Buddy Rogers playbook. At least if you listen to Bruno Sammartino, he'll say that. The first time I ever saw a match where I could tell something was amiss. This match is actually on the DVD that accompanies Tuesday Night at the Gardens, A History of Pro Wrestling in Louisville, by myself and that lovely and talented individual, Mark James. Because it's one of the few remaining matches that were filmed on 16 millimeter film in the Gardens and still exist. That's why we put it on the DVD that accompanies the book. Order today at JimCornette.com. However, it was Ray Candy and Tommy Gilbert. Tommy's Eddie's father, obviously. Ray Candy was a journeyman babyface at that point in time. Big black guy from Florida. Later on was a heel in the Zambui Express with Bad Leroy Brown. But anyway, Ray Candy and Tommy Gilbert against Crazy Luke Graham, and another heel that worked briefly in the mid-'70s. I don't ever know what happened to him, but just his name was very plain, John Rogers. John Rogers. That was a very a puffy name for a heel. John Rogers. Anyway, Tommy Gilbert picks John Rogers up for a vertical suplex. And Tommy Gilbert gave a great vertical suplex. I have to think, and on reviewing the DVD, that this was the inexperience of this Rogers fellow. That imagine he's got him straight up and he's about to go backwards, but Rogers, not knowing where the fuck he's going or how to take it, apparently goes over backwards before Tommy starts taking him. Right? He just said, fuck it, I'm going. And he ended up, it looked like a goddamn pocket knife folding up the wrong way when Rogers's feet hit the mat before Tommy Gilbert had even fallen down, but Tommy was falling backwards. And the point is, Rogers fell on his fucking leg and broke his leg right in two, right there in the middle of God and everybody in the Louisville Gardens. And him and Luke were supposed to win. Well, Tommy turns over and starts to do something, and it seems like forever, but quickly, I'm sure it became obvious that John Rogers was not going to get back up. And there's an element of, here comes Crazy Luke Graham in to do something and draw the referee, and he gets in a thing with Ray Candy and blah, 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 and Rogers ain't going to get up, and they got to figure out something. In some way or another, they maneuver around to where Luke Graham reaches in with his gimmick thumb and fucking hits, I think, either Tommy Gilbert or Ray Candy, whichever one it was, and boom, and Rogers with the goddamn broken leg gets an arm over. But that was a situation where, what the fuck, when something like that happens, there's always an element of awkwardness. And in this case, the guy probably that had just got his leg broken was going to be the winner. So you have to call an audible, and they got around it. With Steve Austin and Owen Hart, I don't blame those guys, because it wasn't a situation where it was a broken leg. It would have been better if it had been, but on a broken bone, you instantly know, okay, this guy's fucked. Whatever. I can't regain my feet, but with a stinger, which is what they thought it was at the time, you can be permanently fucking immobilized, or you can have all the feeling come back in your extremities in the next 10 seconds. They didn't know what to fuck. And there's Owen was experienced. He knew he had to lose. He's trying to figure out something. He's given the guy a second. I think Austin had never had that happen before to him, so he's trying to figure out what's going on. And it did look really bad. In hindsight, instead of Owen arguing with the referee and backing up and tripping over Steve, who could barely hook the leg, the only other way I think out of it would have been if Owen had gone to pick him up and just grabbed one of Steve's arms and put himself in a small package, just rolled right into it. And even then, I don't know what the fuck, but that was worldwide television pay-per-view. And, that's a big decision to make on the sperm of the moment. So every situation is different, but it's not, in that case, it's not as easy to switch gears in midstream or to come up with something on the fly as you would think it might be. In some cases it is. I mean, this has happened in a variety of fucking instances, where, it ain't ballet and shit changes. Sometimes people just get knocked out. Well, there you go. So it has to be on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, there has been some instances that I've seen in time where you're just like, shit, what the fuck do we do now?
What is the referee's responsibilities when someone gets hurt?
Publicly to not see, I hate the X signal because everybody now knows what it is. Publicly, the referee should never let the people know that anything is wrong, even if you have to call it. If you call it because a guy is down and injured, that's a legitimate call in any kind of combat sport. So if the referee does it in a manner that doesn't instantly tell people, oh shit, I'm making this up and this is not what we're supposed to be doing, but the guy's really hurt, then you can get away with the referee stopping a fucking match because the guy's fucking hurt. It could happen. But sometimes it's guys' body language. As far as business-wise, not pertaining to the public, a referee's responsibility is when a guy tells him, because it's easier to tell the referee something than it is your opponent in a lot of cases, unless you're already in a hold or the guy's laying next to you. If you need to communicate with your opponent, the referee is a helpful conduit. If a guy says, I'm fucked up, then it's up to the referee to relay that definitely to his opponent, and also hopefully through some other signal that the individual promotion has. It's not so goddamn glaring. Oh shit. Because they put the X up when guys were really hurt. Like nobody's going to be able to figure that out. It's plain as the nose on your face.
Yeah.
And then they started using it as a work. So now you can't tell, but once again, it's just, oh, look, now they're trying to work us by making us think it's real. It's just blah, blah, blah. Every promotion can have their own signal. A good producer, I've done this. A guy just did it to me in MLW. Jim, if you can hear me in your headset, scratch your fucking head. I just scratched my head. And nobody else, maybe my head itches. Right? It's the same thing. Have a signal that the referee can communicate to the back. We're going to need some fucking help, or this guy's fucked up. He definitely needs to let the opponent know. And then, based on what's supposed to happen and how important it is, it just you have to figure out the best way about it, and everything's different. Anyway, that's that.
All right.
I have one other thing to read, and then I will turn the show back over to you.
Okay.
Scott, writes, I was just a little kid and enjoyed going to the American Legion Arena here in Jonesboro, Arkansas to watch wrestling. One Saturday night I was there and beautiful Bobby Eaton was there as well. During the show, him and I believe Sweet Brown Sugar, Coco Ware, I could be wrong, I'm pretty sure it was, were standing in the hallway to the dressing rooms watching the matches, and I hated Eaton. I would run up to him and give him the finger. I spat on him. I dumped the ice from my drink on him. I was horrible. Later, as I grew older, I fell in love with watching you in the Midnight Express. I always told my wife this story and told her if I ever get the chance, I'm going to find Bobby Eaton and tell him that I'm sorry. I needed my damned ass whooped. Eaton never flinched at my actions, never got angry. He was a true professional. I believe if I was Bobby, I'd have just gone back in the locker room, but maybe that's just me.
It keeps happening.
Yes, well, yeah, he spat on him. He gave him the finger. He dumped the ice from his drink on him. And later, the cup of piss was just really out of bounds. He continues, Scott does, to say, a few years ago, my wife was doing her rotations at a hospital in Wynne, Arkansas, and she came home and told me she drew blood and did the blood work for Bobby Eaton. I jumped up and started getting dressed. I was headed to Wynne to apologize to this man, but she said I couldn't do that. She'd get into trouble. So here I am at 46 years of age, watching your shoots on YouTube and come across this website, my website, JimCornette.com. I am hoping this email reaches you. With all that I have, I hope you can tell Bobby Eaton I'm sorry for my behavior back then. I'm grateful that as a kid I got to witness greatness in the ring. I love to hear your stories, and I'm very ashamed for acting in such horrible behavior to a man whom everyone holds in high esteem. Please tell him I am sorry. Well, Scott, I did. I called Bobby Eaton, and I told him what you had done, and I told him about your apology, and he said, you tell that little motherfucker that I said that. No, Bobby forgives you, Scott. And he said, but the rest of those fucking little assholes in fucking Jonesboro, Arkansas, including that Randy Hales, can go piss off. See, even people 30, 35 years later can be reached and come back to the proper side of things and realize the error of their ways and modify their behavior.
Every week it seems like we have a letter that's either I spit at you or hit you when I was a kid, or my grandmother did it, or there's a tale in my family that years ago you were in Dallas and grandpa tried to slug you. There's always something.
And I was once gutted with a rusty fishing knife in Star City, Arkansas by a band of rowdy fucking Cajuns.
By someone looking for Sonny King.
There you go. All right. Well, anyway, so now I'll turn the show back over to you, Brian. See if you can do any better now.
All right. I'll tell you what, one question before we wrap it up, because we are getting close to the end time here. This question
We're getting close to the end of times?
Well, you never know with this show. But this question was sent in to CornyDriveThru at gmail.com from James Lawrence III.
There was two more of them that came beforehand, and they still tried a third time to get it right.
As I was watching a September 1995 episode of Smoky Mountain Wrestling, after the attack by the thugs on the heavenly bodies with wood planks, during an interview, you have the camera pan down and show Dr. Tom's injured leg, and I noticed his boot had 3-inch soles. My question is this: was this something he chose to wear? Or was it part of the WWE outfits they had him wear when they came back? Also, if they were platform shoes, how tall is Dr. Tom actually?
Tom Pritchard is actually only 4 feet 7 inches tall, but because of the miracle of television, here, and once again, there's another thing that's been lost since we lost the territories and the ability to use foreign objects and gain unfair advantages in clever and different ways. Following up on the lead of the grappler Lynn Denton, of the number one hillbilly, the king of Kingsport himself, Ron Wright, of Inferno Clubfoot back in the 60s, who was either Curtis Smith or Frankie Kane, depending on, I think it was Frankie Kane. Bobby Hart, in the great tag team of Bobby Hart and Lorenzo Parenti, managed by Gentleman Saul Weingeroff, and I'm sure literally 50 other wrestlers. Tom Pritchard had a loaded boot. He started out And I still have his boot gimmick. He gave it to me for my collection. But he started out in Continental because he did the super kick, the enziguri super kick, where you would go up beside and behind a man's head with your right foot, right? You throw the left foot into the gut, and when he catches it, you throw the right one. Boom. And poor people got smart to that. Maybe you just shouldn't catch the foot. But what Tom did, because he was a heel, was he got this apparatus made where he slipped this thing it was made out of leather, and it has some white tape so you could see it real good. And it's got some quarters under the tape so it looked like some fucking metal under there. And it had an elastic piece. He would, when the referee was down or the team was in need or whatever, he'd slip the thing over the toe of his boot and put this elastic piece around the heel. And he'd go and surprise the guy and throw that left foot in there, and the guy'd catch it. He'd hit that right foot with the loaded fucking shit on his boot and knock the guy colder than a banker's heart. With the heavenly bodies, I suggested, why don't we go ahead and go the whole way and do the loaded boot and announce that because of an injury, Tom Pritchard, it was always a various story. Sometimes it was because I have a birth defect. My one leg is shorter than the other. I need a built-up sole to even out my stance so that I can compete athletically on a fair basis with the rest of the wrestlers. Or because of an injury, in whatever manner, I need to wear this orthopedic boot that evens me out, that stretches the leg, whatever the fuck. And obviously, when the referee wasn't looking, if you fucking stick your foot back and you tap the toe 3 times, that tells everybody in the building that you are loading the boot, that you are putting whatever substance is in that obviously hollowed out sole, whether it's lead or whatever the fuck it is, you're putting it into the front of the toe. And when you kick the guy and he sells it like he's going to the electric chair, then that proves it. And then you fucking flop back and you kick the fucking heel of the boot on the mat 3 times to get the fucking loaded substance out of the toe. So when the people scream and yell and complain and the referee checks the toe of the boot, it feels just fine. It's a simple fucking wrestling. Everybody's heard of this. This is goddamn second nature to everybody. And that's what they did. And it would start riots. And you would have fans not only trying to hit the ring, but trying to pull these motherfuckers' boots off. Ask Lynn Denton, or ask the fucking Clubfoot Inferno, or ask fucking Ron Wright, or whatever the case. That boot was more valuable than gold to those wrestling fans. And any time that the babyface would start unlacing it and trying to get it off, the place would blow and the people would come unglued. And if they ever did get a fucking boot off of any of those guys, and lo and behold, take it and whack the guy in the head with it, then immediately he'd get color and he'd start bleeding because it was the fucking feared boot. And he'd put his own finish over. And then you'd have matches where the opposing wrestler that had to fight the guy that obviously was cheating and wearing this loaded boot would have a special boot of his own made. And they would, there was endless ways you could go with it, but it all centered on, obviously, still promoting fucking wrestling and doing shit that works and gets fucking emotional response out of people and trying to cheat.
I asked Len Denton once when he was on the Superpodcast what he would tell people, what was in the boot. And he laughed and he said, actually one time in Mid-South, some fan came up to me and he said, I know what you're doing, Grappler. I know you have liquid nitrogen in those boots. And he goes, I thought about it. I said, that's a really good excuse.
There you go. Yeah.
So liquid nitrogen in the Grappler's boots.
Yes. And it's not that hard to adapt things that other people have done and been doing for 50 years or 100 years to try to win a fight in an unfair fashion. The fucking documentary they did on HBO where that boxing manager, Panama Lewis, and I can't remember what his fighter's name was, but they actually hollowed out the most of the stuffing of a pair of regulation gloves and managed to slip them on their fighter in a fight in the garden back 30 fucking some years ago. And he gave the other kid wouldn't quit, and he gave him permanent brain damage and hastened his fucking death with the beating that he gave him. And it was a big fucking scandal and people got banned out of boxing. Or there's fucking liniment in the eyes, grease on the body. These things are legitimate ways that people have tried to cheat in boxing or wrestling or mixed martial arts, and you do takeoffs of that that stuff because it's rooted in reality. And if you don't get too hokey and over the top, people fucking believe it, and it gets heat, and it helps you sell some tickets. But since everybody's too cool for school now and thinks they're too cute to do these old things and instead wants to come up with this goddamn dog and pony show hoo-ha and saga from days gone by that they've creatively written, well, fuck off.
Well, speaking of fuck off, the drive-thru has closed. All right. You get... You can hear more. You motherfucker. You can hear more of Jim Cornette this Thursday on the Jim Cornette Experience, debuting, and you can listen to. You totally threw me off. I don't know what's going on.
You don't know what's happening.
Follow
we're in a time warp this weekend anyway. Hopefully, I had a good time at going where I haven't gone yet.
Follow Jim on Twitter at @TheJimCornette to read all about the Chicago arrest that happened this past weekend, as well as follow me on Twitter at @GreatBrianLast. You can hear me on the 605 Superpodcast at 605pod.com, or available wherever it is that you find your favorite podcasts. Subscribe to tinyurl.com/official corny YouTube, or just go to YouTube and search for Jim Cornette and come right to the channel. Subscribe now. We have more videos going up in the weeks and months ahead. It's a great time to subscribe.
Watch me on Saturday nights also, on MLW, on BN Sports, while you can, as long as they're in the Midwest area.
And visit JimCornette.com for Cornette's collectibles, t-shirts, autograph photos, DVDs, books, restraining orders, burger towels.
Loaded boots.
Do you have loaded boots? What is it loaded with?
I may soon. It'll be loaded with liquid nitrogen. What else would you load a boot with?
Well, get yours today, and good luck shipping that, Jim. But until...
Wait a minute. How many sizes would I have to keep in stock? And would I have to make people load the right boot? Or would they have an option of loading the left boot? Because I don't want to sell both boots. I just want to sell the loaded one.
Then I would just do the right one.
We got to do some research on this. We'll figure it out.
Well, we'll see what we can find out next week on the Drive-Thru, or this Thursday on the Experience. But until then, for Jim Cornette, I'm the Great Brian Last. Tally-ho!